Welcome back. In this episode, we're going to begin to talk about Chapter 5.2 Health Effects of Air Pollutants. The health effects of environmental pollutants are often somewhat difficult to ascertain due to the duration of exposure and the difficulty of separating environmental exposure from other exposure parameters. When we talk about health effects, we'll generally group health effects into two criteria: acute effects and chronic effects. Acute effects are normally associated with short-term symptoms that may or may not go away with time. Most often, these affect those who are predisposed to respiratory effects, such as the sensitive groups identified in the earlier parts of Chapter 5. Examples include irritative bronchitis, inflamed asthma, and conditions of bronchial restriction. Long-term effects, chronic effects, might be cancerous effects, so a short-term or long-term exposure that results in a long-term effect. These can be chronic bronchitis, such as sustained inflammation and swelling, or for the airways, something like pulmonary emphysema that can be caused by chemical pollutants as well as particulate pollutants. We also need to have a basic understanding of the human respiratory system. The human respiratory system starts with the nasopharyngeal region. That's the airway that includes the nose and the oral cavity. Shown in this figure in blue, the nasopharyngeal region is where particles in air enter the mouth and proceed down into the air exchange region in the lungs. The cilia act along the trachea or the windpipe, and they include the fine hair-like particles that line the entire system and transport mucus up and down the throat column or the windpipe or trachea. The tracheobronchial region, shown here in this figure as the diagrams, the right superior, right middle, right inferior, lobar bronchius regions, and superior lobes, are the regions which include approximately 20 bifurcations of the heart, so 20 branches going into the lungs. The trachea is the largest branch. From there, it branches into the two bronchi, which go into each lungs. Then the bronchi and bronchioles extend through farther branches into the bronchioles, which begin to get us down to the air exchange region of the lungs. The smallest bronchioles are only about half a millimeter in diameter. The air velocity in this range is typically about 7 centimeters per second, where the air velocity in the trachea or windpipe is much larger at 145 centimeters per second. The pulmonary region is where air exchange occurs. The pulmonary alveoli, or tiny air sacs, are on the diameter of about 0.2 millimeters, but despite that tiny diameter, they have a surface change area of about 50 square meters. This is the region where oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged. Here we see in the upper right the alveoli region with blood vessels exchanged between them. The blood going through the alveolar sacs comes in blue, carrying carbon dioxide, and leaves as oxygenated blood, red in color, going through the arteries. In this diagram, we see a schematic of the branching of the trachea going from the windpipe through the first branch, which is the conductive zone, down into the tracheobronchial region where air exchange happens below the 17th branching. In this air exchange region, again, oxygen is diffused through the cell walls into the red blood cells, and carbon dioxide is diffused outward and then respired out into the atmosphere. A simpler diagram is shown here, showing the tracheopulmonary region, showing main lobes of the lungs, main bronchi, as well as the air exchange in the alveoli. Respiratory diseases generally interfere with this air exchange process through multiple fashions. One respiratory symptom can be hypoxia, inadequate supply of oxygen. This can be caused by the poor functioning of the lungs or poor exchange of oxygen through the alveoli sacs. Cyanosis is actually the condition where people begin to take a blue hue or color due to the lack of carbon dioxide in the lungs and potentially the buildup of carbon dioxide. Hypercapnia is excess carbon dioxide in the lungs, and dyspnea is the inability of the body to supply oxygen. This can be caused through physical traits, but also through psychological phenomenon as well. Typical oxygen content in the air is 21%. At only 19.5%, we can have reduced functions, biological functions, caused by oxygen deficiency. At about 17%, hypoxia begins to occur, deteriorating night vision, increasing our heartbeat, and accelerating breathing. Thus, for sensitive individuals, as oxygen levels get low, they can significantly increase the incidence of heart disease because of the increased mechanics of the heart trying to pump more blood through, getting more flow. The greater flow is required because there is less oxygen in the blood. At 14 to 16% oxygen in the air, muscle coordination begins to deteriorate. At 6 to 10%, serious symptoms occur, and at less than 6% of oxygen in the air, we see death within a few minutes. Respiratory diseases can also have other symptoms, including irritation, cell damage, allergies caused by pollutants as well as particulates like pollen, cat hair, fibrosis, which are lesions consisting of stiffening protein structures in the lung tissue which prevents the air exchange, and oncogenesis is tumor formation. Those tumors can be cancerous or non-cancerous. So some things to think about as we proceed through the health effects section of air pollutants are, what are the dose-response relationships for pollutants in human subjects? So is there a relationship between the dose of a chemical and the response that's seen? We'll discuss this for some of the priority pollutants. Are persons with underlying cardiopulmonary disease or heart disease more sensitive than healthy people due to air pollutants? Can otherwise apparently healthy persons who are unusually sensitive to pollutants be identified? And if so, what would be the basis for this hypersensitivity? How could we identify sensitive individuals discussed in the air quality index criteria? And what are the conditions that lead to significant human responses to simultaneous exposures? So, for example, if there's a natural exposure to smoke in the air from a wind fire and smog also in the air from industrial sources, how would we differentiate between these two factors? What can we do about them as engineers and healthcare and environmental scientists? Take a moment to think of those questions before moving on to the next sections where we begin to look at specific health responses due to the priority pollutants.